Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I am your host, Max Reimer. Now, as Republicans, we try to fight government overreach and we try to fight against the government being intrusive in our lives. Some of us do it better than others. Today we are here with a good friend of mine, Howard Root. He is the author of Cardiac Arrest and the former CEO of Maple Grove-based Vascular Solutions. And he experienced this firsthand. So he experienced a lot of government overreach, I guess you could call it, and experienced firsthand what it means to have a government come after you as a business owner. So we're excited to have Howard here today. Howard, thank you for joining the Republican Roundtable.
Thanks for inviting me, Max. Great to be here.
Great. So for the folks at home, let's talk a little bit first and foremost about your story, which is a harrowing story detailed in the book Cardiac Arrest, 5 heart-stopping years as a CEO on the Fed's hit list. Cover that a little bit for us. What happened to you?
Well, I'll give you the beginning and then the end. Obviously, I'm here tonight, so I'm not in prison, so I was not convicted of anything. In fact, I was fully exonerated. But the way it got there is the amazing thing. I started Vascular Solutions 20 years ago, in 1997. From an idea, I created a company. We had 650 employees. We had 100 medical devices. We were selling our products worldwide. And all of a sudden, one day, I get a subpoena from the government asking for documents related to one of the most insignificant products we ever sold. And from that day, it snowballed from an investigation into a prosecution. And eventually, 5 years later, I was in a courtroom in San Antonio where the government was trying to throw me in prison because they claimed a sales rep was saying a bad word to a doctor about an insignificant product that did not harm anyone. Mm-hmm. And at that point, you realize that these things can get so far away from the truth, so far away from justice, so far away from anything that matters that you just have to write about it at the end. So after winning that trial, without calling a single witness in our defense, I've been brought down to San Antonio for a month. 3 weeks, the government puts on a case, and after that we say, there's nothing here. Mm-hmm. We call not a single witness in our defense. The jury comes back unanimously not guilty. I walk out of there and say, I've got to write a book about this to tell people what can happen and hopefully to change the system a bit so that prosecutors are incentivized for justice rather than being incentivized for scalps.
Right. And one thing that you cover in the book, and just for, again, the audience at home, we're talking about this long, kind of drawn-out process where the government proactively came after you, brought you down to Texas. And keep in mind, up to this point, you had run a business. It was a publicly traded company. You were profitable. How much money did you spend on legal fees when you went down there?
Well, the total cost for the 5 years was $25 million. And the reason was so much is we had to hire 121 lawyers to represent us. And the reason we need so many lawyers is the government, when they get involved in this and don't get their way, the prosecutors amp up the charges. And so they bring in all of our former employees and all of our current employees and all of our customers. And each one of those people needs their own lawyer. And usually they need a local lawyer down in San Antonio where they brought the charges for no good reason. And so the company pays for all those legal expenses because it's good to keep everyone on the same side, no one arguing about other things when the government's coming after you. Right. So over that 5-year period, we had the money. We had $40 million in the bank. So we could spend $25 million and not destroy the company. But the average defendant, 99.9% of defendants in America are not as fortunate as I am. Right. They don't have the money, they don't have the company, they don't have the support. And I was trained as a lawyer, so I kind of knew what the process was. Mm-hmm. If they don't have that, they really get destroyed by the process more than they get destroyed by the charges.
So a lot of innocent people presumably have gone to jail for similar circumstances that you experienced at Vascular Solutions. Is that a fair assumption?
It's a very fair assessment. They also plead guilty to things they didn't even do because they cannot withstand the process. Since I wrote the book, about once a month I get an email from someone going through something similar. Just yesterday I got an email, I'm going to talk to this person tomorrow about what they're going through and maybe help them so they can manage it and navigate it to where at least they get to the courtroom where they're presumed innocent and they can walk out a free man like I did. But the hardest question I have to ask them, the worst question I have to ask them right at the start is, how much money do you have? Because if they say they've got $100,000 to fight the federal government, I got to shake my head and say, you're going to lose. So you're better off pleading guilty to something you didn't even do because you cannot spend the money to withstand the process to get to the courtroom to prove that you were innocent.
Right.
And that's, to me, is just sickening. That's not about justice at all.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to change the system rather than just have guys like me who are fortunate enough to beat the charges saying, well, we won at trial, so it's really not that big of a problem. Right. It is a problem for anyone other than people like me.
Because it's not like the government then, once they're done with you, they've learned a lesson and they're going to change their ways. It's just on to the next situation like yours where they can collect a scalp. And the reason that I bring that up, and one of, I think, the most disturbing parts in this book was you had made mention that there was basically a disgruntled ex-employee who was the whistleblower in this case.
Right.
And one fascinating thing, and I don't know if our audience is aware of this, is the actual kind of kickback you get when you bring a corporate whistleblower case. There's a fee that you get based on what the government collects from you. Can you talk about that a little? That
Absolutely.
Just seems crazy.
Right. Yeah, the hardest thing, if you haven't gone through this type of process, it's almost you have to suspend your disbelief. You know, you talk about suspending disbelief when you go into a theater. Now it's life and not art that requires the willing suspense of disbelief, because you wouldn't think that prosecutors would use this system in this way. The way it works is a disgruntled person, whether it's a former employee or a competitor or whatever it is, makes up a charge and files a lawsuit and gives it to the U.S. attorney in secret. The U.S. attorney looks at it and decides whether they're going to go forward with that charge. Yeah. If they do, 25% of whatever money the government ultimately gets out of the company goes to that disgruntled person. So in our case, a disgruntled former employee who did not get promoted for the job he wanted and decided to quit, decided to create a $20 million fable about me and my company to try to get 25% of that, or $5 million, to turn his life around. And from that, they started the investigation without talking to me, without looking at me, not willingly to sit down with me at all. The prosecutors believed that person, who was a money-motivated individual, as opposed to looking at the real facts of the case. The only time the prosecutors realized that they had a loser was when we got to trial. And their own witnesses on the stand contradicted their theory, and that's why we didn't have to call a witness in our defense. But for that to happen in America, where the government's case falls apart, and one of the jurors told me afterwards, said, what the government did to you, your company, and your employees is nothing short of criminal. That's the jury wanted to put the prosecutors in prison and let me go free. But after this case, you're absolutely right. The prosecutors learned nothing. The 4 prosecutors on my case, the 1 investigator, they still work at the government. There's not even an investigation of the misconduct that they engaged in to try to prosecute me. The government has learned nothing from this case. You know, if it was it's a figurative justice plane crash is what it is.
Yeah.
If it was a real plane crash, they'd have the NTSB out there investigating what happened. But in this case, there's no one from the Department of Justice who wants to look at what went wrong in this case and what can be done to learn from that in order to change it for the next defendant.
So this was under the Obama administration. Clearly, in my opinion and most of our viewers' opinion, a clearly hostile administration to businesses, especially corporate America. When we talk about the Obama administration to now under the Trump administration, because I think you were dealing with folks like Sally Yates, right, and comparing that a little bit to Jeff Sessions. Have you seen any kind of, in your activism, in your speaking tours, in the things that you're discovering? I know you went out to D.C. a little while ago. Have you seen any difference, any kind of carryover, or I guess what's the difference between that administration and this one when it comes to prosecuting businesses?
Yeah, so this is a problem that was exacerbated in the Obama administration with Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch and Sally Yates at the very end. But it's a problem that's been in the Department of Justice before then. And in the Republican administration, it's still there. Remember, Senator Ted Stevens was prosecuted wrongly and convicted wrongly and then exonerated, but only after he lost his Senate seat. And because of that, we have Obamacare, because he was the 51st senator. That seat was, or the 61st, that actually allowed Obamacare to get adopted. So the Department of Justice views itself as the least political organization in D.C. when people who work inside say they are the most political organization.
Right.
They choose who to prosecute and where to go and when. Now, they can use that power as they want to, whether it's against business in the case of the Obama administration, whether it's against other political opponents in the case of other administrations. They can do whatever they want, and there's not an effective check on what prosecutors do in America. But it's not just the Department of Justice. There's prosecutors in the local offices doing the same thing. If you remember the football coach at Minnesota State, Mankato, had his life turned upside down because a local prosecutor thought innocent pictures of his children in a bathtub was child pornography. And only after he got his job thrown out, destroyed, his life destroyed, he had to move out of town, did they finally look at it and say, no, that's innocent photos from a father.
Right.
The prosecutor in that case was allowed to retire. Nothing bad happened to him. The defendant had his life destroyed even though he didn't do anything wrong. And that's where the problem is. We have to look at prosecutors the same way we look at police officers. When they do good things, that's wonderful. When they do bad things, that's inexcusable in America. That's something that needs to be corrected.
Right. So we have the book, and we know that you're doing some speaking tours and you're getting involved a little bit locally. What is your mission at this point? What things are you doing right now to change the system?
Well, my big cause right now, that my case is over, now I turn to my cause. My big cause is to change the system, to shine the light on the prosecutors, to see if we can get really a balance to being about justice. In my case, one of the prosecutors said, we've invested our blood, sweat, and tears in this investigation. At this point, we need a scalp. They calculate a return on investment.
Hey,
that just shouldn't happen.
Repeat that.
He said, to my lawyer, he said, at this point, we've invested our blood, sweat, and tears in this investigation, and we need a scalp. So they needed someone to plead guilty to a crime just because they had spent 4 years at that point investigating this and spending so much money. They calculate a return on investment in the Department of Justice. Their press release says they make 610% on every dollar invested in fighting healthcare fraud. Now, if you have a prosecutor showing up with a badge, any business in America will give them $1 million just to go away. Okay. So calculating a return on investment in the Department of Justice is never the right answer. That's the culture that needs to change. And you asked, is it going to change? I'm hopeful. I'm trying to get a meeting with Attorney General Jeff Sessions to go over my case, not to try to just look at it individually, but look at what it means in terms of his actions to change that culture. Mm-hmm. Just a little bit of light shined at the prosecutor's actions, a little bit of notoriety and a little bit of punishment for the people who did bad things will cause the other prosecutors to step in line. That's my belief. That's the starting point.
And let's keep in mind, too, you were a Minnesota-based business, you were a job creator, you were a publicly traded company, and ultimately, this whole situation caused you to step away from your company.
Right, and how insignificant this product was. This product made up 0.1% of our sales. It had been cleared by the FDA 8 separate times. It could be used by the doctor for anything they wanted to use it for, and it never harmed a single patient. And yet the prosecutors wanted to put me in prison because they said that the sales rep was saying a word that I didn't tell him to say, that I told him not to say, that wasn't harmful to anyone, but the prosecutors claimed was outside the scope of our FDA clearance. When I realized that that's what you can be prosecuted for, I said, I don't want this job anymore. I mean, the instruction to the jury said, you do not have to find that Howard Root did any act in order to put him in prison. All you have to find is that he had power and authority to prevent or correct the violation, and he failed to do so. Mm-hmm. So it's a strict liability crime, if you will. Wow. And when I realized that, I said, okay, that's it. I went back to my board of directors and said, I don't want to do this anymore. I started it 20 years ago. We developed 100 medical devices. We generated $1 billion in sales. We created 650 good-paying American jobs without a single dime of government grant money. But I didn't want to do it anymore. At 56, I sold my company and I retired. And I just probably will never do medical devices again.
So instead, you are entering an equally dangerous profession, if you want to call it that even. You are entering a little bit of the world of politics. So obviously, we've seen you fill in on a number of just local political shows. You know, we know that you're working on a campaign right now. What has that experience been like, shifting from the company you owned to this whole situation going down, retirement, and now being in this world versus the medical device world?
So I want to be clear, I'm a political advocate. I'm not a political candidate.
You're a hack just like all of us.
Right. So here's the one thing. When you get early retirement, you still have energy. Sometimes you get to do things that you couldn't otherwise do. And when I was a public company CEO, well, there's two kinds of public company CEOs. There's liberal public company CEOs who can say anything they want, and there's conservative public company CEOs who learn very quickly to keep your mouth shut. Because if you're associated with the conservative cause, the shareholders, the public, the media can go after not only you, I could withstand that, but my company. And I wasn't going to put 650 employees' jobs on the line because I came out for a conservative cause that the mainstream media or anyone else thought was the wrong position to take.
Right.
But once you sell the company and you don't have a job, then that opens it up. So now I said, well, that's great. I've always had an interest in politics. I want to work with the right people to get elected. I've got money now, too, so I can contribute. I've got all the time in the world. My wife doesn't want me home that much. So I've got the time to do what I want to do and pick my causes carefully. And so I've done that. I'm working with Tim Miller in the 7th District against Colin Peterson because I think that's a district that Republicans can win in Minnesota. Trump won that district by 30 percentage points in the last election, and Colin Peterson, a 28-year veteran of Congress. Everyone in the district admits 28 years is too long. I think Tim Miller's the guy, so I've agreed to sign on as his finance chair and work with him. And then there's other people in the Republican side as well that I'm getting involved with, from local races all the way up to hopefully the U.S. Senate race too against Amy Klobuchar.
Absolutely. This is a pretty broad question, but in your just short time in this world, what have you learned? What have you learned about Minnesota politics and Minnesota politicians and our system, if you want to even call it that?
Right. Well, I've got 56 years in this world, so that's not a short time, but I've only got 6 months in the political world.
Right.
And that was an amazing thing to me because I had so much invested in Vascular Solutions. All my free time was tied up in business. And all of a sudden I step into politics at 56 years old and I start asking questions. Why are we doing this and how can we do that better and who needs help over here or what can I do over there? And it's amazing. First, people are very receptive to your offers to help. They want you to come in. They're very receptive to money offers as well. That's always helpful as well. But there's a lot of things we can do in the Republican Party that I think business people have done better for years that I'm trying to help people do on the political side. Messaging. I think we can be clearer in our messaging, to be positive in our message, to have politicians who smile a lot. There's all simple things we do when we're selling products that also apply to when you're selling a candidate, because a candidate is the ultimate product. That's what you're selling. So as I look at that and I talk to people and I work with them on their speeches, on their messaging, on their fundraising, on their overall approach to how you persuade people to vote your way, to me that's extremely interesting. Now, I approach it being 6 months of experience, so I'm not in it saying I know everything, but I have some different views. I may be right, I may be wrong, but there's things that we certainly can do better in the Republican Party. What I've noticed mostly is we've got a lot of good people. I think we can get much better on our messaging. I think we can be much more positive, and I think Minnesota's turning red. I think Minnesota has a real possibility of having maybe even 6 of the 8 congressional districts be represented by a Republican very soon.
The governor's race?
The governor's race I've kind of stayed out of because there's so many people, and the one thing I know is there is a long-standing kind of, I wouldn't say it animosity, but there's politics in politics. What a shock. And if you get into something that's hotly contested on the primary and the endorsement side, I just don't really know where to stand and where not to stand. So right now I'm firmly agnostic on the governor's race and getting involved where there's really a solid candidate I believe in more of an uncontested area to help them out.
So touching on a political issue, but then also an issue with your background in mind, healthcare is kind of a hot button, both national and state issue. We've done a lot of different kind of pushing and pulling to reduce the cost of MNsure and other things in this state. Now, your background in medical devices, you have a unique perspective, I think, on the healthcare issue. What do we have to do? It seems like Congress is not going to do anything at this point about reducing healthcare costs or even repealing, in some form or fashion, Obamacare. And then at the state level, we have things like reinsurance and tax credits, which are trying to reduce the burden that an average Minnesotan family is facing. What would be, in Howard Root's ideal world of healthcare, what would be the solution to keeping healthcare costs low for families?
Yeah, I think I do have kind of a unique perspective because we sold our devices to doctors and hospitals. We had to get reimbursed from the insurance companies. I sold worldwide, so we dealt with 55 to 60 international countries' healthcare systems. And then I had health insurance from my own 650 employees. So we touched every side of the healthcare equation. When I look at it, the first glaring mistake that we're making in America is assuming that government-provided healthcare is going to be improvements. And they say this as if the European model is what we want to go after, and the people talking about it have never worked in the European model of healthcare. And I have, and I can tell you that's not something that will apply in the United States. The doctors are more of a factory employee. The patients are run through the hospitals on a quick basis. They do not get their choice of doctor. They don't get their choice of procedure. It's something that would not be applicable to Americans and American healthcare. Yeah. On the other hand, I've seen what insurance companies are doing in the United States, and I don't like that at all. We're getting to where it's an oligopoly, and it's almost a monopoly of United Healthcare and Aetna and a few others providing it. We're limiting on our choice across state lines, which is horrible. But the biggest problem I see with American healthcare, if I had one thing that I would do, I would make it tax neutral, whether you bought the insurance policy or your employer bought the insurance policy for you. I'd want individuals to be buying the policy and have them take it with them when they lose their job. The biggest problem we have in America is when you lose your job, you lose your insurance. And that's usually the time that you don't want to lose your insurance.
Right.
That's when pre-existing conditions become a problem. That's when we have to have COBRA. And then when you're at the job, you don't get to choose what insurance you want. You don't get educated on what the insurance provides. The employer provides it to you. So if we could have it where the employer gave the employee money tax-free for the employee to pay for their own insurance policy, then the employee's policy would go with them after they leave the employment, and it'd be more like auto insurance. I mean, there's a reason why people know more about their auto insurance than they do about their healthcare insurance. And it's because you buy your auto insurance and your employer just gives you the healthcare insurance.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's not where the discussion is headed today.
Yeah.
It's headed in a completely different direction, at least on the Democrat side, to single payer.
Yeah. And within our state legislature, then, I made mention of it before, but one thing that they kind of spearheaded was a reinsurance program to kind of subsidize some of those cost increases. In your mind, was that a good idea? Should we have gone that route? Because I think it's pretty confusing for me. What did we do?
Yeah, well, it's a Band-Aid. It's 100% Band-Aid, and that's not derogatory because Band-Aids are good. If you're bleeding, you need a Band-Aid, and we were bleeding. MNsure is a disaster. If I had my way, I would have eliminated MNsure and gone back to the federal exchange. It might not have been that much better, but at least it doesn't cost us hundreds of millions of dollars and then have this constant reworking and issues with MNsure. So unfortunately, MNsure is here right now. We thought all of Obamacare would be gone, but MNsure is here, and right now we got to figure out how to deal with it. The problem is if insurance premiums go up on the individual market by 30 to 40 to 50%, people are going to lose their insurance. They can't afford it. So the state has to step in order to support that to get those policy premiums down. The only way to do that is to reinsure the high-risk people. We used to have a policy called MCHA, M-C-H-A, I can't say it. That was great. It was a high-risk pool. It was something that the state financed, and it kept those high-risk patients out of the general population, so it did not affect how you and I would buy insurance. Unfortunately, Obamacare made that go away. So now those high-risk patients are included with the other individual market patients. That's driving the cost up. So the way the legislature had to deal with that was to do the reinsurance money in order to get the premiums down so it wasn't destroyed next year. But we're going to have to do it again next year and the year after that, unless we change this where we can go back to the MCHA model, which is much more efficient at getting those high-risk patients insured.
I want to pivot back a little bit because you had made mention about even helping out in the Senate races with Amy Klobuchar. You've been causing a little bit of a stir on Twitter with the Judge Strasse situation. Right. What has been your involvement in that whole debacle, quite frankly, that we're not even turning in the slips to approve this guy?
Well, I'm interested in it. Judge David Stras is on the Minnesota Supreme Court. He was nominated to get promoted up essentially to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. He'd be the Minnesota representative. It'd be a great thing for us. And in that process, the Senate has these archaic policies. This one's called the blue slip process, where the senators in the home state where the judge is being nominated from. Now keep in mind, the 8th Circuit extends all the way down to Arkansas. So there's no Minnesota control of this. But Amy Klobuchar and Al Franken are given a veto power that the Senate Judiciary Committee will not even bring these people up for consideration unless the senators in the home state return the blue slip, which says they're allowing it to go forward. It's not a law, it's not a rule, it's just a Senate practice, and it's archaic. So Senator Klobuchar and Senator Franken were delaying for about 2 to 3 months turning in the blue slip. They had no reason to object to David Stras. He's an excellent jurist. Alan Page says he's a great guy. Sam Kaplan says he's a great guy. These are not Republicans.
Right.
These are liberal Democrats saying that he's a great judge. But they didn't want to take a position. Amy Klobuchar, Al Franken did not want to. So I, along with Scott Johnson from Powerline and some other people, were kind of asking on Twitter and elsewhere, what's going on, Amy? What's going on, Al? Turn in the blue slip. And what was happening is Senator Klobuchar was trying to negotiate with the Trump administration to get her own appointments for the district court judge, for the marshal, for other places, for the U.S. attorney. I consider that unacceptable. So when we pushed them on it, they decided to come out publicly and say, we're not turning in the blue slip for David Stras, which would characteristically block his nomination. But now we're pushing for Senator Grassley to ignore that. Because it's been ignored before. You don't have to accept the custom of the blue slip. You just need the senators from the home state to say what they believe. Now they should move forward with Justice Stras' nomination and confirm him for the 8th Circuit, because he's a very qualified judge for Minnesota and for the 8th Circuit.
Very good. Well, Howard, thank you so much again for joining us today. Where can people go online to find out a little bit more about your story?
Thanks, Max. It's on my story on my website. It's howardroot.com. And if you want to buy the book, Cardiac Arrest, it's available on Amazon. It's available in hard copy. It's also available on Kindle. And it's also available as an audible book. So it's all available there, right on Amazon.com.
So thank you all again for joining us today. Please check out the book, Cardiac Arrest by Howard Root. It's a fascinating story, and it will make you really take a second look at the people you're paying in your government. Thank you all again for joining us for the Republican Roundtable. Until next time, I'm Max Reimer.